as I was just saying to our speaker, a systematic but intermittent interest in Anatolian archaeology has always characterized this society's interests. And we're absolutely delighted today to be able to hear Professor James Osborne talking about this really very, very important site. I was just saying before we started that when I used to be tramping around that area in the 1990s, I used to say to people, that really looks like a very, very significant mound. And even professional archaeologists would worry a bit and say, it looks very big. So in those days, I think that there was some trepidation about tackling such large projects. But of course, now, 30 years later, perhaps in various ways, it's a little bit easier. Anyway, that's what we're going to hear all about. And so the title of our talk today is The Discovery of a New Bronze Age and Iron Age Kingdom in Turkey, the Site of Türkmen-Karahöyük. So, Professor Osborne, the stage is yours.
Very good. Thank you, David. I will share my screen again. Bear with me for one moment. There we go. I think you should all be able to see a full slide now. Is that correct? Take silence as confirmation. That probably means everything is looking the way it should.
It's absolutely fine. Go ahead.
Oh, good. Thank you. Yeah, so as David was just mentioning, we're going to hear about today the discovery of this large mound that you can see on the slide here, and an excavation project, a survey project that's taken place on it for the past 5 years or so, and then an excavation that finally just began after many years of anticipation this past summer. And it's all been very exciting and really galvanized Anatolian archaeology a lot because of what we were able to find even before we put any shovels into the ground. And I'll tell you some of these shortly, but just not to bury the lead. In some, even by survey alone, we were able to find a major urban center in south central Turkey that archaeologists didn't know existed before. And that already is very, very transformative to our understanding of the Bronze and Iron Age periods. As you can see from this photograph, it's a very, very large mound, and yet one that somehow escaped the formal attention of archaeologists. I say formal now because David, of course, in the preamble was mentioning how archaeologists in the region had long known about this massive site, but it had never been formally published as such, never been technically discovered and presented in scholarly literature, which is kind of remarkable given its scale. And I guess that's just the nature of archaeology in Anatolia. There really are still very, very massive things to be discovered. As David mentioned, I recognize a few names in the audience here today in the Zoom participant list, but I do understand that most of you are more or less completely unfamiliar with the culture and history of this time and place, which is fine. So let me just begin very briefly by giving us a brief orientation to the time periods that I'm talking about. During the late Bronze Age, which as you can see here is roughly the second half of the second millennium BCE, let's say 1650 to 1200 BCE, give or take, most of Anatolia is occupied by what's known as the Hittite Empire. And the Hittite Empire is Anatolia's first major indigenous or autochthonous imperial formation. It's a local phenomenon, a local cultural expression that really conquered most of Anatolia at some point or another in the course of its 450 years of existence until about 1200 BC, when it collapsed along with many other political empires in the Eastern Mediterranean in the famous Bronze Age collapse that you've probably heard of, the Mycenaeans, the New Kingdom, Egypt, and the Middle Assyrian Empire. There's all kinds of major transformations that take place around 1200 in this region, and the Hittite Empire is no exception to that. And in the following 200 to 300 years or so, during the start of what is now called the Iron Age, it's very difficult for me or any other scholar to place kingdoms on the map of Anatolia because we don't know much about them. Archaeologists used to call this a dark age, dark in the sense that because we don't have historical texts, we don't know what's going on politically. That's changing over the years. We're discovering more and more texts and more information about this period. every passing summer with excavations and projects at places like Taltainat and Carchemish in the southeast that are proving, in fact, that our early Iron Age or Iron Age 1 is more like not a dark age, maybe an age dimly lit. But in any event, by the early first millennium BC, we now see very clearly again the reemergence of genuine social complexity with the Neo-Assyrian Empire out of northern Mesopotamia, which would eventually expand to conquer most of the Fertile Crescent. The precursors of what will famously be known as the Greek city-states in the Aegean world, that's when they are beginning to coalesce and congeal into what will become such the famous Hellenistic civilization. And then in central Anatolia, we find that the Hittite Empire has been more or less replaced by a new kingdom called Phrygia, which is a term that comes ultimately from our Greek sources. The ancient Near Eastern term for the kingdom of Phrygia, we think, was Mushka. Now, some of you probably have heard of Phrygia. For those of you who haven't, you may have heard of its capital city, Gordian. And if you haven't heard of Phrygia or Gordian, I know you've heard of King Midas, he of the Golden Touch, who, by the way, is a historically attested figure. He's a real person who existed, whether or not he was able to touch things and turn them to gold, but he definitely lived and reigned as king of Phrygia in the late 8th century BC, let's say 725, give or take. BC is when he was ruling. And then in southeastern Turkey is a cultural phenomenon that I know you haven't heard of. This is the Syro-Anatolian culture complex. I know you haven't heard that term because I made it up myself. It's a complicated and confusing region culturally, archaeologically, linguistically, ethnically, and as a result, it's been given a wide variety of labels. I won't get into this now. It's not the subject of today's talk, but suffice it to say, I just decided to call it the Syro-Anatolian Culture Complex, or SAC, as a way to simplify things. It provides some terminological clarity. And as you can see here, by the way, of interest is the fact that the Konya Plain, which is right where my cursor is now, and I will show you better maps in the future, but the Konya Plain is really on the geographical interface between the Kingdom of Phrygia and SAC, and that will become relevant later as well. Now, just to give you a bit of background into my own research interest in the Konya Plain, which is this part of Turkey right here. This is a map from a book I wrote about SAC a few years ago now, and each dot is representing a major city or settlement that we know about from Iron Age southeastern Anatolia that's been explored before and is relatively well understood. And by the time I'd written my dissertation on this subject and written the subsequent book that came out of the dissertation project, I was, and also working at this site number 14, a site called Taltainat, for 12 or 13 years, I was feeling good and ready to try something new. And so I thought, well, I'm an Iron Age Anatolianist. That's my region and time period of specialty. What's a part of the country that wouldn't be too far afield? I still want to remain an Iron Age guy, but maybe let's find a place that hasn't been as well explored and doesn't have as many dots on the map, so to speak. And so I turned my attention on the other side of the Taurus Mountains, now looking at the Anatolian Plateau proper, and realized that this region that the Assyrians called Tabal during the Iron Age was dramatically underexplored. There's, as you can see on this map, just a couple of dots on south central Anatolia for the Iron Age. And in fact, most of those aren't even archaeological excavations. In this case, they're just landscape monuments, isolated features in the landscape that we've known about for a long time, but haven't systematically explored. And so I thought, okay, this region of Turkey for the Bronze and Iron Age is ripe for exploration. Just so we have a better understanding geologically of the Konya Plain here, this green box is showing more or less the location of the Konya Plain. As you can see, there's a river that runs through it. That's the Çarşamba River, which in Turkish means the Wednesday River. And it has created, by virtue of its annual flooding and annual deposition of sedimentation, a very rich alluvial plain that's incredibly fertile agriculturally. And because it's fertile agriculturally, it's also incredibly rich archaeologically, because, of course, it's been a magnet for settlement really since the dawn of agriculture, since the beginning of the Neolithic period. And friends and colleagues of mine, especially my current collaborator, Michele Massa, had started, by the time I was already thinking this might be a good place to explore, had already started a new survey in the Konya Plain called the Konya Regional Archaeological Survey Project, or CRASP. And what you can see on this website, which is now defunct since the project no longer exists, is a classic Anatolian tell, or huyuk, as we say in Turkish, an archaeological site that's mounded and is formed by the successive occupation of multiple layers of settlement stacked one on top of the other, such that the deeper one excavates, the earlier one gets in time. And there are hundreds, literally hundreds of these from all periods across the Konya Plain, from the Neolithic all the way up through the Ottoman period, all the way up to the present, really. There's truly several hundred of these settlements, almost none of which had been explored scientifically by archaeologists. I think the major reason for that is because of what we call, sort of colloquially on our project, is the vortex or the gravitational pull of Çatalhöyük. You probably know a little bit about Çatalhöyük. This is the World Heritage Site excavated by James Mellart in the 1950s or 1960s. Now I'm forgetting exactly the years of excavation, followed by Ian Hodder in the 90s and early 2000s. This is one of Turkey's most famous excavations, one of the most famous Neolithic sites from anywhere in the world. And because it was so famous and attracted so much attention, we think that it just sort of gave the impression that the Konya Plain was well understood for all periods. But of course, it was only occupied during the Neolithic period. And there's this entire sequence of hundreds of Bronze and Iron Age sites that had nothing to do with Çatalhöyük and that nevertheless had never been explored. So we were very excited about that. I think another reason why the Konya Plain was not very well researched for the Bronze and Iron Age period is because our historical record for it from the Hittite Empire and from this Iron Age period belonging to what I've called the Syro-Anatolian culture complex is pretty scant for the region in question. So what this image is showing you is a screen grab from what's probably my favorite website on the internet. If I had to pick one, I'd pick this one. It's really great. It's called HittiteMonuments.com. And it's nothing but monuments from the Hittite period and from the subsequent Iron Age. There's no advertisements, there's no mess. It's just really fantastic. And each one of these places is a link that you can click on and it will pull up photographs of the monument. It'll pull up a brief bibliography and there's like a paragraph or two describing what it is. It's just really fantastic. And this guy at the bottom right, Typhoon Bilgin, a Hittitologist, is the one we have to thank for that. So the red places, the red dots here are showing you where Typhoon's marked landscape monuments and inscriptions that belong to the late Bronze Age, the period of the Hittite Empire, and the black ones then belong to the post-Hittite Empire period, our Iron Age monuments. And as you can see here on this map with my green square of the Konya Plain overlaid on it, there aren't any inscriptions or landscape monuments in the Konya Plain. So as a result, it's tended to draw historians' attention elsewhere, because of course, naturally, they're going to be paying attention to the places where landscape monuments are extant. I mean, that's stands to reason, right? You're going to be devoting research to places where you know historical events are happening because the texts are discovered there. As we'll see, that might be, the absence in the Konya Plain might be a catch-22, where the lack of research in the plain has generated a lack of text, which generates the lack of research interest. And now we think that picture is also changing. The two monuments that are very nearby, as you can see on this map, just on the southeastern edge of the Konya Plain, are the ones that are called Kızıldağ and Karadağ. And these had always been a long-standing mystery for Anatolianists, because we haven't really understood them very well, either historically or chronologically or culturally. This rock outcrop. So I'm looking at Kızıldağ here. Kızıldağ means crimson mountain in Turkish, and it's so called because it's got this tractite rock boulders strewn all over the surface of it that are reddish in color. And the two gentlemen standing on that rocky outcrop are standing on what Anatolian scholars refer to colloquially as the throne monument, so called because it looks like the seat for a giant to sit on his throne. And what that person in the orange shirt is apparently touching, although of course he shouldn't be, is this relief that you can see in the top right of your screen. And that is a picture of a seated ruler with a cup in his right hand and a staff in his left hand and his feet on a footstool. And then in front of his face is an inscription. And that inscription is composed in a script and language known as hieroglyphic Luwian, which is a sister language of Hittite. So this is a very normal language to find in an inscription in and around the Hittite Empire period. This is a major language of the Hittite Empire in the centuries following. And this names the individual as one great King Hartapu. There have always been, in the past century or so, since this inscription and monument came to light to scholars, a number of mysteries surrounding it, one of which is the chronology of it. The picture of the king looks, for all the world, like a Neo-Assyrian king from the 8th century BC. The inscription looks like it's been written in archaic text from the 13th century BC. So I've never really understood when this was made. We also have no other sources describing who this guy Hartapu is or was. We've never known anything about the guy other than these isolated texts on Kızıldağ and Karadağ. And we also haven't known where he lived, where his kingdom was based, what site he ruled from. And that star then marks the location of Türkmen-Karahöyük. So I'm sure you can already see where I'm going. Türkmen-Karahöyük is very likely Hartapu's center, but I'll get back to why I think that in just a minute. Here then, I'm standing on Kızıldağ, looking at another hieroglyphic Luwian inscription written by Hartapu here to the left of the cursor. But also, if you gaze 13 kilometers in the distance, you can see Karadağ now. That's Dark Mountain. That's an extinct volcano that towers over the Konya Plain. And at the very peak of it, right there, is another inscription composed by the same man, Hartapu, who describes making a dedication to the storm god of the mountain, presumably referring to this volcano itself. And by the way, if you're ever in the Konya Plain, I strongly recommend that you make a visit to Karadağ and Kızıldağ. Kızıldağ is a special place too, but if you can make it to the peak of Karadağ, which you can drive up to if you have a sufficiently robust car, it's a stunning, stunning view over a huge expanse of southern Anatolia. By the way, if you're interested, right under my cursor there is Kızıldağ. So that's where I had been standing in the previous slide, looking backwards towards the view from this image. The inscription on Karadağ is unfortunately part of this military installation today, so you can't go visit it, unfortunately, the way that you can at the throne monument in Kızıldağ, which you can actually scramble up to and stand on yourself. But yeah, gazing over the view of the crater of the volcano, which even has wild horses running through it, it's an absolutely beautiful spot. So all of this then brings me to my interest in the Konya Plain. As I said, my friends and colleagues were already surveying it. And I went and visited them the summer of 2017 or 2018. And I said, look, you guys have a great survey project. I know you're traipsing around every mound in the Konya Plain, dating them by the ceramics that you're finding underfoot and so on. I'm an Iron Age, Bronze Age archaeologist. I wonder if there's anything of interest. Are there any sort of appealing or juicy Iron Age sites, Bronze and Iron Age sites that someone like me might be interested in working with you guys on? And they said, boy, have we got a site for you. And that's this site of Türkmen-Karahöyük. It's 35 meters tall, and it's about 700 meters in length. It's not quite, it's sort of ovular in shape, so it's not quite that wide, but in total, it's about, the mound itself is about 30 hectares, and at 35 meters in height, by volume, it would be one of the largest mounds in Turkey. And as I was saying on the very first slide, somehow it has more or less escaped the attention of archaeologists all these long years, despite the fact, bizarrely, that the Konya Plain has been surveyed multiple times. First by James Mullard back when he was working on Chatham. So we don't really have a good explanation for that, for why this site has escaped attention for so long, except that maybe it was large enough that it appeared almost like a natural feature, one that the surveyors wouldn't need to go visit. I don't know. I don't have a good or satisfying explanation for it, but so be it. It hasn't been known in the scholarly literature until the CRASP survey identified it and discovered it and published it, and then invited me to go visit it. And then as soon as I had, it didn't take long to realize that this was a special place. And so I asked Michele Massa, my current collaborator, and then the survey director, as I mentioned, if he would be interested in the two of us working on this site long term, first by learning as much as we could about it from survey alone, and then eventually by excavating it. And luckily he agreed, and we've been working together on the site ever since. We started by doing an intensive survey. And what these dots are overlaid on a satellite image of the mound. You can see the modern village of the same name sort of spilling off the southern edge of the mound. And each of these dots is representing a location where a surveyor went, staked out with small flags, a 10 by 10 meters square, where he or she would then count and collect all the pottery that was chronologically sensitive from within that 10 by 10 meter space. And what are we trying to accomplish with that? We're trying to do two things. The first is simply to understand the exact aerial extent of the site, like just how big a site are we dealing with here? And the second would be obviously to understand its chronological history. When was it first occupied? At what period was it at its largest extent? When is its final period of occupation? These kinds of questions. We surveyed, the black dots are surveyed locations we didn't get to. The yellow dots are survey squares that we did get to. And in total, we surveyed something like 340, 350, I can't remember the exact number, 10 by 10 meter squares across the surface. The reason we're doing this kind of sampling strategy, of course, is because it's so large that if we tried to collect every single piece of pottery off the site, we'd spend the rest of our lives doing nothing but that. What did we find? We found, as you can see here, that the earliest period of occupation is either the end of the late Chalcolithic or start of the early Bronze Age period. So about 3000 BCE, more or less. The dots here then are showing you those survey units that did in fact produce pottery that belongs to these periods. As you can tell here, it's only survey units that were placed sort of around the edge of the mound that produced pottery from this period. That stands to reason, right? It's lowest down because it's earliest in date, which means on the surface of the mound, 35 meters up, you're not going to find as much pottery from that period. So all of which is to say it's very difficult to understand these very earliest periods, as one would expect. By the second millennium BCE, though, it looks like now we have settlement spread all the way across the entire 30 hectares of the site, because now we have survey units that are producing second millennium pottery everywhere we turn. And then by the late Bronze Age and Iron Age, we now have late Bronze and Iron Age pottery from not just the main mound, but also from these low mounded sort of suburb or satellite mounds off in the distance, more or less effectively doubling the site in size. And as you'll remember, the late Bronze Age is the period of the Hittite Empire. The Iron Age is the period of these Syro-Anatolian kingdoms that followed next. So it would seem that during the Hittite Empire and in the period immediately following the Hittite Empire, the site was doubled in size, really exploded in size, which would suggest that during the Hittite Empire and during the Iron Age, it was an extremely important center. In fact, we are pretty confident that in the Konya Plain during these periods, Türkmen-Karahöyük is by a wide margin the largest site in the entire region. Probably, just based on scale alone, probably the local capital city. So that was already very, very exciting for us. And then one day while we were surveying in 2019, Michele and I were standing with a clipboard somewhere in a field over here, exploring this pale circle, which you can see that's in fact a Hellenistic period tumulus, which is also interesting, but the subject for another day. And we were looking at the pottery under our feet and making sense of what we were trying to see if there was anything to be noteworthy over here. When a farmer drove up to us in a tractor, which is perfectly normal, gets out, smokes a cigarette, asks what we're doing. Sometimes these interactions are very positive, sometimes they're negative, and they want you to get the heck off their land. Sometimes they're very curious and want to know more about what you're doing, and they're just excited. We had a very pleasant conversation, and he got back in his tractor and drove away. But after about 50 feet, he stopped the tractor and turned around and came back and said, "You know what? If you guys are archaeologists and you're interested in old stuff, I don't know if it's important for you, but about 50 feet behind you in the canal that we were standing beside, there's a stone that's covered in all these weird signs. I don't know. We just chucked it back in the canal, but it's right there if you want to go take a look at it." And indeed, just 50 meters or so from where we were standing was the stone that he was describing. And of course, we dashed over immediately. And this is my friend and co-director Michele Massa, who couldn't help himself from jumping into the canal, even though it's muddy and swampy and completely unpleasant, because we could see even from the top that this stone, this boulder here, was very likely an inscribed stele, royal stele, and indeed it was. I'll show you more about it. I'll show you some good photographs and tell you what it says in just a minute, but not to bury the lead here again. Our inscription that we found was found in this canal right here. And the Karada inscriptions and Kızıldağ inscriptions that I was just mentioning to you are visible from it. And what do you know, but the Türkmen-Karahöyük inscription that we were shown that day is composed by none other than great King Hartepuk, the famously mysterious man who had written landscape monuments on Kızıldağ and Karada. So if you couple our inscription composed by great King Hartepuk with the tremendous size of the site during the Late Bronze and Iron Age periods when Hartepuk would have lived, it seems very clear that Türkmen-Karahöyük was the capital city during those periods, that it was the royal seat, it's the place where Hartepuk would have reigned from, and hence its proximity to Karada and Kızıldağ. And by the way, you might not be able to make it out in this photograph, but you can see it pretty clearly if you have decent eyesight. This is a photograph I took standing on the throne monument of Kızıldağ, looking out into the Konya plain, and there off in the distance is none other than Türkmen-Karahöyük. So it seems pretty clear to us now that all of these inscriptions were written more or less the same time, and that they were integrated sites, that they're part of a large sacred landscape. We've reconstructed, Michele and I have a sort of sacred ritual processional path or trail that Hartepuk, we conjecture, may have followed as he conducted certain ceremonies of the style that we know Hittite kings had to perform. They were constantly traversing the landscape and performing significant rites on mountain peaks and so on. This is a well-known Hittite religious trope, and we presume something similar is happening here, based on the proximity of Kızıldağ and Karada to Hartepuk's capital city at Türkmen-Karahöyük. So we have then, just by discovering this text and its association with the settlement of Türkmen-Karahöyük, we've already been able to propose solutions to several of these Hartepuk mysteries. We now know that Hartepuk was a local king who ruled over the Konya plain. We don't know the name of his kingdom yet. We know that he reigned from the site of Türkmen-Karahöyük. although again, we don't know its ancient name, the ancient name of that city. And now we know why he was making monuments in what had seemed like the middle of nowhere, because it wasn't the middle of nowhere at all. It was very much part of his kingdom and part of his sacred landscape. Now, what about the dating issue? And there we have to look at the content of the inscription itself. And this is our project photographer, Jennifer Jackson, performing what's called reflectance transformation imagery, which is a form of photography that allows you, in which you take several dozen photographs of an object, but move the flash around. So the camera stays in exactly the same location every shot, but the flash or light source moves around in a different location. And then with software, you can stitch those images together. And because you have a composite image with multiple different light sources, you can use your cursor in special software and drag the light source across the thing that you're looking at and get really high resolution and textured imagery. In some cases, even better than you would be able to get if you were looking at it up in person. So for example, this is the inscription as it looked as it looks like in regular photography. It's not bad already. You can make out a lot of detail. But here's a still of what it looks like under RTI. Again, to make a still, it's sort of an artificial reduction of what it is. Ideally, I could, if I were showing you a live shot on my computer of the RTA software, I could drag my light source across the stone and the shading would change as I moved my cursor, and you would be able to examine each individual sign up close. You could probably already tell that this inscription is unusual in the sense that the beginning of it is written in relief up here, and the remainder of it is incised. And this is highly unusual. Most hieroglyphic Luwian inscriptions are written in one or the other. And we also don't have a satisfying explanation really for why this is the case. I tend to think of it as a practice stone, maybe a scribal exercise, although that is very conjectural. Some people wonder if it's unfinished, and maybe they were intending to continue carving the relief where the incised signs are. I don't think that's the case, because the incised signs I don't think are large enough for the size of the relief signs that started the inscription. But again, we don't really know why it has this sort of hybrid compositional quality. Let's look at what the text actually says. Even that day in the canal that Michele and I were looking at this stone, neither of us can read hieroglyphic Luwian, but any Anatolian scholar worth his or her salt knows at least one or two signs, and especially these ones that I've highlighted here in red. So this sign here means great king, and it's always used to mark the subsequent signs as being the name of a ruler. And here, when you have, this is another great king sign, when you have two of them capped by a winged sun disk, that's the Bronze and Iron Age convention to mark a royal name again. So this is, Hittitologists call this a dicula. It functions very similarly to, let's say, the Egyptian cartouche. When you see this, you know that you're looking at a royal name. So even Michele and I, who can't read this text, knew that day and already knew that we had a royal inscription on our hands, and we were very, very excited by that. These signs, by the way, are dated by my colleagues Petra Goedegebuurde and Theo Vandenhout, who translated the text to the 8th century BCE. Incidentally, solving the chronological debate as well. Presumably then Hartupu must have lived in the 8th century BC as well. So what does it actually say? Well, what it describes in the opening line is great King Hartupu, who's the son of Mursili, conquering the land of Mushka. That's very exciting for Anatolian historians, because you might recall Mushka being the local name for the kingdom of Phrygia, the kingdom ruled by Midas and his dynasty. And then it goes on to describe a coalition of kings who try and take advantage of Hartupu's absence on campaign against Phrygia, whom, of course, Hartupu is able to defeat as well. Now, hieroglyphic Luwian, out of interest's sake, as I said, I can't read it. I've dabbled in it just a little bit. I'm very much a dilettante. But one of my favorite aspects of it is that it's not read left to right or right to left, but rather right to left and then left to right and then right to left and back and forth in a style of writing that is very rarely found around the world, although there are other places where it exists, and it's called boustrophodon, which is Greek for as the ox plows, because the ox cart goes one way down the field and then back the other way around the field. So you read it in this direction and then continue reading in that direction and then continue reading this way. In the end, the inscription reads something like, when great King Kartapu, the hero son of Mursili, conquered the country of Mushka, the enemy descended upon his territory, but the storm god of heaven and all the gods delivered those 13 kings to his majesty, great King Hartapu. And in a single year, he was able to place those kings and animals under the authority of his fortresses. And then, as you can see, the last few words are more difficult to make out. So in this inscription, Hartapu positions himself as the conqueror of Phrygia, which until recently, I mean, is currently our understanding for the most powerful kingdom in Anatolia, the kingdom of Phrygia. And here we have Hartapu, this hitherto unknown individual, boasting to have defeated it. Even if he is exaggerating or even outright lying, it's a pretty tremendous claim. Also staking a claim as the most powerful of the many local rulers who were in his vicinity. So this, in told, combined with the size of the site, has really put a new Iron Age kingdom on the geopolitical map of Anatolia that we didn't know existed before, possibly one that was even able to rival the famous kingdom of Phrygia in power and size. As I say, of course, this inscription, you have to read it with a grain of salt, that goes without saying, but nevertheless, just to be able to even make that boast is pretty impressive. And so, as you might imagine, this really took Anatolian archaeology by storm. And I personally made a mistake in an interview with the University of Chicago News where I mentioned a potential indirect association with Midas, since Hartapu and Midas are maybe more or less contemporary, but there's certainly nothing in this inscription that has anything to do with Midas directly. And of course, the author ran with that story. And then as soon as Midas was mentioned, it really exploded in the news. And this was our 15 minutes of fame for the CRASP survey for me and Michele. And people really wanted to run with this Midas thing. And then, of course, it faded from the news, and that's fine. But for Anatolian archaeologists, we all remained excited by it and wanted to continue working at the site and finding out what's under the ground now. So this is the results from survey. What might we find when we actually peer under the surface soil? Well, for a couple of years, we still didn't have an excavation permit, and we were limited to whatever techniques we could come up with for a survey, including something like this. This is me conducting a magnetometry survey where you sort of slowly walk this instrument across the surface of the site, and it detects magnetic anomalies under the surface, or it detects the magnetic signature of subsurface features, because of course rocks will have a different magnetic signature than the surrounding soil they're buried under. And as a result, you can start assembling a low resolution, but nevertheless relatively clear building plan of features that are under the surface even before you've started excavating. So the surface of the mound, we could tell immediately under the surface is a building plan that looks something like this. Why don't we zoom in a little bit so you can see it a bit more clearly? I think you can probably already tell a long street that's coming down about 150, 200 meters or so, several square buildings, or presumably households up on the northern part of the site, and then in the southeastern part of our magnetometry survey. And then in the middle, yeah, these are the households at the top. In the middle are some very large, presumably public buildings. By public, I mean monumental scale buildings. These are upwards 40 to 50 meters in length. There's two of them on either side of the street here. This is probably the monumental buildings that belong to the last period of occupation of the site, because the magnetometer can only penetrate so far down. The last period of the site is Hellenistic in date. So let's say 100 BCE or so. So not Hartlepool city necessarily, but nevertheless showing us where some large-scale public architecture is going to be located. And with that in mind, then, once we had done our magnetometry survey, we sort of felt like we had understood everything that we possibly could about this site without actually excavating it. And in 2024, the Ministry of Culture generously awarded us the excavation permit, and technically to Michele Massa, who's a professor at Bilkent University in Turkey. He's the formal Kaza Başkanı, as they say in Turkish, the director of the project, and I'm a co-director with him. And together in 2024, we started this joint Chicago-Bilkent expedition to Türkmen-Karahöyük, which we call the Türkmen-Karahöyük Archaeological Project, or TCAP. One of the main justifications we had for obtaining an excavation permit that we presented to the Ministry of Culture was just how few Bronze and Iron Age excavations there are in this part of the country. So I realize now, as I look at it, that this legend is in Turkish. I realize many of you will know Turkish, but not all of you. The red dots are showing you early Bronze Age excavated sites. The green squares are showing you middle and late Bronze Age excavations. And the yellow triangles, then, Iron Age excavations. And as you can see, within a 100-kilometer radius of Türkmen-Karahöyük, there's only one Bronze and Iron Age excavation that's ever taken place, and that's at Konya-Karahöyük, which has problems of its own, namely that it was excavated for decades and never published. So for all intents and purposes, there's zero known excavations within 100 kilometers radius of the site, which is pretty remarkable when you think about it. Even 200 kilometers radius away, there's only a handful of them, and they're all off to the east. So this is a real terra incognita for Bronze and Iron Age archaeology, which is also very, very exciting and very appealing. Again, I think that's because of Çatalhöyük, at least partially, but either way, it's very wonderful that the government allowed us to start this excavation, because it's really going to put a whole new part of the country on the Bronze and Iron Age map. So here's a map showing you where we started our excavations. As I say, we only began, there we go. We only began in 2024. So the last summer was the very first season of the TCAP excavations. We only had 5 weeks because the permit was late to arrive, you know, the kind of bureaucratic hiccup that happens not uncommonly in Turkey, especially if it's a first-year excavation and the government happens to be undergoing a new system of regulations and rules for excavations. And we just happened to land our project right when that transformation was happening. In any event, we had a shortened season of 5 weeks instead of the 8 we had planned. So what we did was just have a limited aerial expanse. One in field 1, here's right at the top of the mound where those Hellenistic period monumental buildings were found by the magnetometers. And one in field 2, which is deliberately situated on the slope lower down the mound so that we might be able to target Bronze and Iron Age periods without having to excavate the Hellenistic remains for 10 meters and maybe 10 or 12 seasons of excavation before we get to the actual periods that we're interested in. Field 3 up here in the gully, I'm not going to talk about today. But first, before I show you very briefly the field 1 and field 2 results, and then I'll stop talking, I just want to mention, just to give you a sense of the scale of the site morphology that we're looking at here. In this erosional gully right there, Michele and I had been looking at this eroded wall face every year of our survey, wishing that we could expose it. Once we had the excavation permit, we could. And just as an experiment, we took our trowels and had people working here just for a few days to expose what we now think is the Hellenistic period fortification wall. And as you can tell from this scale, we have preserved here a mud brick wall that's over 3 meters in height and several meters in width. And we haven't even really begun to expose it properly in excavation. So this gives you a sense of the nature of the site. It's all mud brick. Everything inside of this mound is made out of mud brick, like Çatalhöyük beforehand. So that's just something to keep in mind, but also the preservation is really astounding. I mean, 3 meters height for the fortification wall is really, really remarkable. And indeed, next summer, we hope to excavate this more thoroughly. But let's look at the areas where we did start excavating. This is field 2 on the southern slope of the mound, as you can see in the inset here. This is the area that we situated lower down specifically to try and target earlier periods. In fact, we overshot a little bit chronologically. We were hoping for late Bronze Age, early Iron Age, maybe 1200 to 900, 800, something like that. In fact, we found mid-second millennium, right at the start of the late Bronze Age remains. But that's okay. That's exciting too. Here, right under the surface, were found a series of buildings that we could tell, I mean, just scraping the surface soil away, we could see the brick outlines, see the wall outlines. In the end, what was excavated was a series of 4 or 5, we think, domestic buildings. They're not fully excavated yet. As I said, we were only excavating there for a few weeks, but with really strong preservation, with walls, in some cases, upwards of 1 meter high or more. And just to show you what these look like in the process of being excavated, as you can see, this is taken on one of the last days of excavation. We really only have this room here, or this room here, it's the same space from different sides of the excavation square, excavated down to floor level. Even this room, as you can see through this doorway passageway, hasn't been brought down to floor level. And this room on this side, which is this space over here and up here, hasn't even begun to be excavated at all underneath the topsoil. So there's a lot of these buildings left to be exposed. Even with this relatively limited amount of architecture that we could bring to light in the amount of time we had available, we could tell multiple phases of buildings. We can sort of start subdividing it into subphases with little clues like this. For example, here's one wall and another wall, but between them you can see that there's a thin layer of plaster, of wall plaster, that covered this entire wall, even while there's another layer of plaster that joins these 2 walls together, proving that this one at one point existed by itself before this wall was then inserted to create a subdivision of the space. Another interesting feature is that since we're on the southern slopes of the mound, we can see the walls, like this one here, actually tilting in orientation. They're not perfectly vertical anymore. And that's because the weight of multiple meters of millennia of occupation above it are pressuring them down slope. So this is also going to be a long-term conservation challenge, of course, as we try and make sure these walls stay upright as long as possible. So what was in these buildings is also interesting. We have several examples of seal impressions. I think you can see here, these are lumps of clay that have, in this case, have several stamps that have been pressed into it. Maybe you can make out B then being the underside of A, circular impression where this was placed on the top of the rim of a storage jar and then sealed, presumably to ensure that its contents weren't disturbed by anyone but the owner. Here's another seal impression where you can make out actually the individual's fingerprint, which I always find really exciting. It's very humanizing, of course, to find a Middle Bronze Age fingerprint that's, what, 3,500, 3,600 years old, which is pretty remarkable. We also have a couple of these stamped seals themselves, and not just the impressions, but the actual seals. And these are, just by way of comparison, much better preserved examples that are from online museum catalogs to give you a sense of what it would have looked like originally. What would the occupants of these buildings potentially have been administering with this sealing technology that is typically understood as representative of administration techniques? Well, we also have over a dozen of these loom weights, and these are used to process textiles. They're part of the textile production industry. Basically, as a weaver is weaving their threads, they use these loom weights to hold the threads in place while they do their weaving. And so we're working on a model right now where early late Bronze Age Türkmen-Karahöyük's political economy, at least in this part of the site, may have been characterized by textile production and the administration of textile production. In just the last few minutes here, then, I just want to show you very briefly this other excavation field, and then I promise I'll stop. We've long known, even though Michele and I are both Bronze and Iron Age specialists, that the site is equally exciting to our classical archaeological colleagues because it has this massive Hellenistic settlement at the top of it. And the villagers in the mound, whenever they dig a well in their garden or put in a new garden plot, they turn up these Hellenistic bits of artifacts. So we think that the modern village is where the lower town of Hellenistic Türkmen-Karahöyük was located as well. And here too, this part of Turkey has been dramatically understudied. In this case, because of course, all the classical archaeologists like to work in Western Anatolia, where the stone cities of Ephesus and Pergamon and Miletus are located. The mud brick mounds of central Anatolia are less compelling for classical archaeologists, or at least that's been the case so far. But we think Türkmen-Karahöyük has a lot to contribute to them as well. So Field 1 then was placed directly on top of this large-scale public building that I've already shown you, that we hope will provide evidence of the monumental quarter of this part of the city. We're now right at the very surface of the mound, about as high as we can get, 35 meters over the surrounding plain. And in our two 10 by 10 meter squares, we found building remains that more or less correspond exactly with the results of the magnetometry survey, which was itself gratifying. Here you can see it in plan and in photograph. And in this case, since in our shortened season, we could only begin to expose it in just one room on either side of the division between the two squares, we're very excited because we know that this entire building complex was very violently destroyed. And there's just an incredible amount of debris inside of this space. Burnt bricks that have collapsed on top of a floor level that we haven't even reached yet. Here, we're fine gridding the soil here so that our paleobotanist can begin to take soil samples and understand the ancient dietary patterns of the Hellenistic occupants of the site. But it's chock-a-block full of whole vessels, whole pots. There's a ceramic bathtub that we found. The material culture from this stratum of the city is going to have incredible preservation that is really going to shed light on Hellenistic Turkey. And here's just an example of some of the material culture that we were finding here that date to about 100 or 50 BCE. And of course, we'd love to know who the historical agent is to have destroyed this city. You can picture maybe Roman armies, but it's completely speculative. We really just don't know who caused the destruction of the Greek city of Türkmen-Karahöyük. These are some of the metal finds here, again, to show you a strong level of preservation. This is an iron ring, a bronze pin that was covered in textile that presumably comes from the dress that it was clasped to. These objects, of course, they haven't been fully conserved yet, but once they are treated by our conservator, they're going to hopefully sparkle. So all of this has really excited us, and next summer we have very large excavations planned. We plan on expanding our current fields. We plan on exposing new fields. We have a lot of work to do, as David mentioned right at the very beginning of the site. Maybe one of the reasons people haven't talked about this site is because they're also daunted by it because it's so large. It seems like a bad idea to tackle even from the first place. But we're in it now, so there's no going back. We're forging ahead, and hopefully this will be just the very beginning of a long-term, multi-decade-long excavation project that will bring this newly discovered Bronze and Iron Age capital city and Hellenistic city as well to light for Anatolian scholars. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there. As I said at the outset, I've got plenty of time for people to ask questions or to talk about this site. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for your attention so far.
Well, thank you very much indeed for really an absolutely fascinating introduction, which I hope will be only the first of many talks that we have the privilege of hearing about this extraordinarily stimulating, interesting project. So who would like to, perhaps we should stop screen sharing now so that we can see each other. There we are. Well, just before we invite questions from colleagues, I just wanted to comment on this very interesting point that you make. Certainly, the question of size was really, really important to the people I was discussing this matter with in the 1990s. They would look at it enormously daunted. See, that was a time in Britain where there was a real worry as to whether there was the possibility of large sums to do what were going to be capital-intensive projects. It was a widespread idea. The British Museum conversion had been a failure. Covent Garden had run massively over budget, uh, and that kind of sort of that sort of worry trickled down. And at the same time, there was uncertainty as to how one could put together really large sums of money. Along with an active exploration of the idea that maybe archaeology wasn't so important anymore. And what the archaeologists meant by that, of course, was not doing archaeology, but not doing excavation. They thought they might be able to do an awful lot just by synthesizing the vast amounts of data that you could obtain through surface survey in the integration of existing results. So that's one side of it. But the other side, and I think you're absolutely right when you mention this, is the fact that we have to remember that the most of the archaeological institutes were based in Istanbul, and the British were in Ankara, and ARET has a branch in Ankara. But in particular, the British, who regarded themselves as being the great specialists, who of course had the permission to dig at Çatalhöyük and therefore the license given out in the name of Britain, were really only interested in prehistory. And I think that's the other reason. I think that those prehistorians who were prepared to dig were not really interested in going in that area for a site that was obviously later. I think that must be the other reason. So we've got a number of different things coming together. Disinclinations, worrying about coordination of large projects, combined with a fascination for basically going as early as we possibly can.
Right. Yeah.
Anyway, I don't know what you think about any of those observations.
No, I think that's. I think you're entirely right about that last one in particular. Um, right, archaeologists in this part of Anatolia, indeed, were interested in finding the earliest farmers, the earliest sedentary dwellers. Right, interested in origins. That was just sort of the research question for several decades, which this site doesn't speak to particularly. But it speaks to other things that I think are worthwhile, like this early states and the political geographies that are completely understudied in this part of the country. To your first point about institutional funding, I happen to be very fortunate that I'm based at the University of Chicago's Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures, or ISAC. It used to be known as the Oriental Institute. We changed our name not too long ago. And ISAC luckily has a pretty healthy endowment that's able to maintain long-term commitment to relatively expensive field projects. By itself, it's not enough to fund Türkmen-Karahöyük, an excavation as large as we would like it to be. And we're still going to be reliant on external funders, things like the federal funding agencies in the United States that have been thrown into question in the past week, as you may have read about in the news. Things like the National Science Foundation or the National Endowment for the Humanities, which traditionally like to support these kinds of projects, but might not be doing that for the next 4 years. So that is something we're very worried about. But if it weren't for institutional commitment to go alongside an individual scholarly commitment, it's very difficult to maintain a project like this.
Yes. I can see that John Curry has a question, but just to follow up with one sentence there. And we have to remember that the BIA was founded against the idea to disprove the claim that there was no Neolithic in Anatolia. That was the point.
Isn't that incredible?
And it was such an important claim to disprove that one can understand why that they should be very excited about getting results that would demonstrate that. Anyway, please turn to the next colleague. Please, John, go ahead.
Yeah, James, thank you for a very enlightening presentation. I just happened to teach the collapse of the late Bronze Age last week to one of my classes, and this just seems right on point. I just bought this book, the After 1177 BC by Klein, which I suspect you're familiar with, and he has this idea that, when the Hittite Empire collapses, that it doesn't so much, collapses, that people just are sort of forced to kind of migrate by, climatic change, these kinds of problems, and that they sort of gather in this area that traditionally has been excavated around southeast Turkey and northern Syria. So what I was wondering is how this, discovery might impact upon this general picture, at least based on what's obviously a very preliminary set of assessments that you have so far.
Yeah, that's a really good question. Exactly what happens in Anatolia following the Hittite collapse is, yeah, a major concern for Anatolian archaeologists. It's pretty clear that in the Hittite heartland, that is within the bend of the Kızıl River, there's some pretty profound changes there. I mean, Hattusha becomes a shadow of what it had formerly been. The settlement pattern system seems to shrink dramatically. Writing more or less goes away. And as Eric and others have pointed out, yeah, seems to be a lot of evidence for people moving into the southeast of Turkey and northern Syria, as you said. However, southern Anatolia, the region of the Konya Plain, because it's not the Hittite heartland, is a region, and for all the reasons David and I have already been talking about, has not been studied for this part. So for this time period, we can't yet tell if there's continuity or discontinuity across the Bronze and Iron Age transition here. And I mentioned that to Eric in a response to his book at ASOR in the fall, where there was a session devoted to his book, to after 1177 BC, that I gave a paper in. And I said in my paper response to him, look, there's like an area basically the size of Jordan about which we know nothing in Anatolia. And it's really difficult in that state of ignorance to really understand, or to make like a grand claim, or to claim that we know the storyline in all its particular areas. Probably there's a very regional phenomenon where there's change happening in one part, like in the north, but maybe there's continuity happening in the south, which is why we still see hieroglyphic written by people like Hartapu. So yeah, hopefully the Türkmen-Karahöyük excavations will speak to this question a lot over the next few years.
Thank you.
You're welcome. There was a question in the comments, I think.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
From Michael. You refer a few times to Hellenistic sites. Would the nascent Greek Empire have reached that far? For example, the pottery, was that imported, or could there have been Greeks living there? Yeah, that's not a silly question. It's a good question. I have to admit my understanding of Anatolia during the first century CE is limited. Partially it's just a complicated time and place. So Laconia is the name of the region that Konya is given during the Greek period. And from everything I've been talking about, you won't be shocked to know that Laconia is also understudied compared with Western Anatolia, the Aegean coast, basically. So we don't know a lot about Laconia. That's the first thing to say. Secondly, is that it's archaeologically often very difficult to discern between a non-Greek person using Greek pottery and Greek material culture versus actual Greek people living on a site using Greek pottery and Greek material culture. And when the Greeks, after they'd spent enough time in Anatolia, for a long time, the word scholars used was Hellenization. Anatolia became sort of Hellenized, let's say. There's reasons why a lot of scholars don't like that word as much as they used to, but in any event, you get the basic point. It's going to be a cultural mix of people, some of whose ancestors are just long-standing Anatolian dwellers, who've taken on the material ways of life of the Greek people that they've been interacting with now for several generations, and some of whom are themselves actual Greek ancestral populations. And which one we have at Türkmen-Karahöyük, well, that time will tell, I hope. Thank you, Nicolo, for your note, and Camilla as well.
Who would like to ask another question? Either raise your hand, please, or just put it in the chat. For some reason, I can't see the chat, so I'll allow our speaker to keep an eye on that.
Okay, I'll keep an eye on it. But you can just chime in. There's no.
Absolutely, go ahead, please.
Michael asks, "What's your number one thing in your dream to find list?" That's a good question. I would say I didn't get into it in this talk because just in the interest of time, but during the late Bronze Age, just so you guys know, there's a white whale of Anatolian archaeology, a famously lost Hittite capital city called Tarkhantasha. There's a king named Muwatalli II who, around the year 1300 BCE, for reasons that historians still debate, moved the capital of the Hittite Empire from its ancestral home in the city of Hattusha, which is a World Heritage Site in north central Turkey, to this place, Tarkhantasha. We don't know where that is. We know roughly where it is. We know, in fact, it's in and around the vicinity of the Konya Plain. And you can see where I'm going with this. And my colleague and co-director Michele Masas recently published the claim that Türkmen-Karahöyük could be Tarkhantasha itself, because we know it's so big during the late Bronze Age period, because we know during the Iron Age it was a capital city ruled by Hartapu. It stands to reason this could have been the very lost city of Tarkhantasha, which is one of the last remaining capital cities of the ancient world still undiscovered. So our dream discovery would be confirmation of that hypothesis, which would only really come in the form of an archive of tablets that mention that. So wish us luck. Maybe in a future season, we'll find that archive. Yeah, that would be a dream come true, but it's going to be fantastic no matter what.
Could I just ask you, technically, how are you going to solve the longer term problem about getting down to the levels that you're really interested in? I know that's a slightly politically incorrect way of putting it, but you get the gist of what I meant.
Yeah, really the only way to do it is a combination of being very patient by excavating the stuff on the top and just sort of grin and bearing it and getting excited by it. I mean, I'm becoming now a classical archaeologist in a way that I never thought I would, and finding that I'm actually really interested in the Hellenistic period, so that's fine. But in any event, just excavating it. But more immediately, you can do things like cheat by coming at it from the side. So our field 2, where I showed you those walls that date to the Middle Bronze Age, that's lower down on the slope. You can sort of, if you come at it from the side, maybe you won't ever be able to find whatever's in the middle of the city, but you'll still find remains that date to the period in question. So that's the goal there, is sort of eat away at it from the side without having to go down from the very top.
Yeah, I see. And the other question that I've always been very interested in is the way that the excavation creates warm and cordial links with the local village. So, for example, have you had to expropriate any land from them? Are you using them as workers, or are there ways that you're kind of sharing them in the intellectual excitement of what you're doing? In general, of course, this is a fantastic challenge right at the outset. In general, how do you intend to manage that and to reach the great goal?
That's an excellent point. I'm glad you raised it. The sort of cultural heritage aspect of it, that, we are really keen to avoid being a sort of old-fashioned colonialist archaeological project. Well, first of all, Turkey has regulations that everything now stays in Turkey. That's always been the case, and that's the case for every project. But we don't want to just abide by the letter of the law. We want to sort of follow the spirit of archaeology right now, which is a sort of post-colonial collaborative spirit or enterprise that we want to be a part of. And so, just to give some more trivial examples, we encourage very strongly / require all of our foreign team members to make a good faith effort at learning Turkish instead of just relying on the odd bilingual team member who might be present. We do hire villagers from the village of Türkmen-Karahöyük to be members of the team as paid employees, and we don't just treat them as laborers, but we actually give them some education in the process, in the practice of archaeology, and in the cultural history of Anatolia. They've started to learn about the Hittite Empire, and some are more interested than others, and that's fine. They don't all have to become Hittite experts, but those who are interested in pursuing it, we give them that opportunity to follow up on it. And one challenge that we have, I have to say, maybe I mentioned this before I started talking with you, David, is that ultimately the villagers' main interest in the site is as a source of economic revenue, whether it's as a place that they can dig themselves and maybe find something splashy that they could sell on the market, like gold coins, or as a place where they see the new visitor center at Karahöyük and think, gosh, one day we could have a visitor center like that, and that would be really good for our village. And that's also fine. We want to celebrate that and lean into that as well, and allow them to see it as a place that has potential for them. It's not something we want to look down our noses at. So between the sort of economic incentive and then the actual collaborative process and actual training and education, we like to think that we're fostering a good relationship with them. I think we are. They're friends with us. We're friends with them. We go to their house for dinner and so on. And so far, so good. We've got a pretty good thing going on with the village, which I like. I think, Jimmy, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Hi, it's Jeff. Actually,
Okay.
fascinating talk. Thanks very much. I mean, you partly answer this perhaps with your response to your question about your dream dig or the thing you really want to achieve. But how? I appreciate this. It may be early days. Clearly, is early days. But how significant do you think this site is going to prove to be in the sort of years, decades to come? I mean, I'm conscious that there are other sites which. I mean, I think Sagalassos, which I'm conscious is probably I guess is not that far from where you're. I mean, in Turkey,
That's right.
Is proving to be a much more significant site than it was than when it was first found. I think. I mean, are you expecting the same sort of thing for this site, or is it too early to say?
No, we are, but I have to also be conscious of what my PhD advisor referred to as the omphalos fallacy, which is that every dig director thinks their site is the center of the world. But in the end, some of them are just backwaters, and there's nothing you can do about that. It's just the reality. So, I'm conscious of that. On the other hand, the discovery of the size of this site and the Hartapu stele, that inscription, which really proved that there was a new capital city from the Bronze and Iron Age that was apparently rivaling the famous Kingdom of Phrygia in scale and wealth and power, really excited a lot of people. And I think it's not just my omphalos fallacies speaking when I say that Türkmen-Karahöyük is a buzzy site right now for Anatolianists. It's something that people are talking about and that they know about, and they're really excited to see what's going to come out of the ground. Whether or not it's sort of an opposite phenomenon maybe, where the site is now thought to be way up here in terms of importance, and we kind of now have to meet those expectations, and whether or not the site ends up being as important as people seem to think that it might be is still to be determined.
Thanks.
In chat, I think. How did I get interested in Anatolian archaeology in the first place? That's also a good question. I went to grad school intending to work in Israel, Palestine. And that was in 2004, I think was my first year of grad school. And my PhD advisor, who was a world famous biblical archaeologist, he couldn't go to his dig in Israel because of things that were happening in Israel, Palestine in 2024, and in 2004, not 2024. And so his dig was canceled that summer, and I joined a project in Turkey, just kind of on a lark, really to get some field experience for that summer, so as not to waste the summer. And then I just fell in love with it. I started learning Turkish, and I realized how much more work there was to do in Turkey than there was in Israel and in Palestine, where it felt like every site was already swarming with archaeologists. And then I just didn't turn back. I just stayed committed. I was like, this is what I want to do. This is really an exciting place. So that's how I got drawn to Anatolian archaeology back in the day, 20 years ago now. Amelia?
James, thank you for that. That was a fantastic talk. This is not really related to your subject, but if anyone is interested in Hellenic towns, I found myself in Amasra last summer and met an archaeologist there in the museum. And there's a lot going on in Amasra as well.
Amasra, okay.
Yeah, it's named after Amastrin, which was a niece of Darius, the Persian king.
Sure.
And Pliny the Younger was there, and just this young archaeologist, he was just showing me around, and there are loads of sites and just beautiful, like kind of statues, almost like just in people's gardens, and
That's incredible.
which is incredible. And it was also a Genoese colony, so the people there are kind of more open to archaeologists and foreigners coming in, and
Okay.
yeah.
Very cool. Cool. Thanks for letting me know.
No worries.
Colin writes, I endorse what David said about the problem of the size mound. I dug with David French at John Hassan. Oh, okay, that's really cool. And he never wanted to dig a big mound. I think he was funded by Origins of Agricultural Project. We had a view of Karada from John Hassan. Yes, I suppose you would have had. It's a spectacular view.
Yeah. Well, so who was that who dug at Jan Hassan?
Colin? See Colin's iPad. Yes. Black.
Wow. Well, that's extraordinary. Yes, the whole point was to keep it small. Yeah, which seems a pity. I think Chicago's ambition seems to be much better. But there we are.
Colin Riddler is the name. I'm an archaeological publisher.
Oh, we met, of course. Yes, but I didn't know you were at Jan Hassan.
Yeah, 1970.
Wow, that's great.
And were you there when they closed it down?
No, I was only there. I was an 18-year-old before I went into. I read archaeology at Cambridge, and then I went into book publishing at Thames and Hudson as an archaeological publisher. But no, we did water sieving and everything, but exactly so. It was the origins of agriculture, prehistory, that they were interested in. I mean, David French, of course, went on to study Roman roads. So it's curious, the sort of period in the middle, he perhaps wasn't so interested in. I don't really know, because he mapped as the late Stephen Mitchell, knew very well. He mapped the Roman roads. But are there Roman roads near your site?
No, there's not. At least not to my knowledge. Maybe people might know better than I would, but to my knowledge, no. That's really neat.
Yeah. It's funny to think that both Stephen and David have passed away now, but there's a story that David discovered his best Roman road because they were having a picnic on a very nice day, and then as they lit their fire, they chucked the match away behind their shoulders, and poof, the undergrowth set alight. And as they were clearing the undergrowth there, they discovered the Roman road.
No way.
It's funny how these little tales of Anatolian archaeology.
Yeah.
That's great.
Anyway, a great talk. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.
Our speaker, of course, said he didn't have too much time, but there is probably time for one more question, I think, if anybody would like to make a final.
Yeah. Oh, right. It's 1:24. You're right. One more would be just fine. Okay. Well, maybe we're tapped out.
Well,
thank you, everybody. Thank you for coming.
In that case, thank you so much for this extraordinary thing. And we, as I said before, we hope very much indeed that at the correct point, you will feel able to share with us the results as they come in, because that would be absolutely wonderful to hear more about it.
Yes, I hope so too. I'm happy to come back in the future. Give me a few years. Hopefully I'll have more to say.
Wonderful. Well, thank you very much, and good luck from all of us.
Thank you very much. Have a good evening, everybody. Bye.
Good evening. Bye.